In March 2020, John Smith, a 34-year-old enthusiast of solitary hiking, heads to the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. His goal is to spend a few days alone with nature. He's an experienced hiker who has been to places like this before, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary. John made his last contact on the same day, sending a message to a friend. Attached to the message was a photo of a stormy sky over the Chiricahua Mountains. After that, there was silence. Worried relatives raised the alarm a few days later when John didn't return as planned and stopped answering his phone. A search operation was launched. Local state troopers, volunteers, and even helicopters were involved in the response. They scoured the area meter by meter, but without success. John Smith seemed to have vanished into the hot desert air. For 3 long years, there was no news of him. The case was considered unsolved, and John was declared missing. Everything changed in the summer of 2023. A group of biologists was conducting routine research on the fox population in the Sonoran Desert, in a remote area far from popular tourist routes. The area was ancient and rocky, with only giant saguaro cacti, silent witnesses of time, dominating the vegetation. One of the biologists, examining the area with binoculars, noticed an unusual silhouette in the distance. Something stood out against the backdrop of the mighty cactus. As they approached, the biologists were horrified. At the base of the giant saguaro, they discovered a human skeleton. The body was unnaturally fixed to the spot. The bones were firmly tied to the cactus trunk with rusty old wire. The heat and time had done their work, but even through the remains, traces indicating a painful death were visible. The bones were covered with multiple minor scratches, as if from wild animal claws, and some areas showed signs of thermal burns. The biologists immediately reported the macabre discovery to the local sheriff's department. A team of forensic scientists and medical examiners arrived at the scene promptly. A preliminary examination confirmed the worst fears. They were human remains, and it appeared that the death had been violent. The remains were sent for examination to determine identity and cause of death. During a thorough examination of the site where the skeleton was found, some clues were discovered. Near the cactus was the charred handle of a portable gas burner and pieces of a military belt with a partially preserved metal buckle. These discoveries were carefully documented and sent for analysis. After some time, the results of the forensic examination came back. DNA analysis confirmed that the remains belonged to John Smith, who had disappeared in March 2020. The most horrible part was the experts' conclusion. There were no signs of trauma to the bones that could have led to instant death. This meant that John Smith was alive when he was tied to the cactus and left under the scorching desert sun. Death was caused by dehydration and overheating. It was a brutal and painful murder. The investigation was resumed with renewed vigor. Now it was no longer just a missing person case, but a criminal homicide investigation. Investigators began to reconstruct the last days of John Smith's life. His friends and relatives were interviewed. They remembered his love for desert hiking, how he often went alone and preferred quiet places. During an additional search of the area, within a few miles of where the body was found, fragments of camping equipment believed to belong to John were found, part of a tent, a torn backpack, and an empty water bottle. These discoveries only confirmed that John had indeed been in the area. Investigators also noticed pieces of a military belt found near the skeleton. This led them to believe that someone with military ties or who used army equipment might have been involved in the crime. A search of local military bases and stores selling military equipment began. Former colleagues and acquaintances of John were questioned to discover if he had conflicts with anyone who might have access to such items. An interesting detail emerged during the investigation. It was discovered that a local volunteer had been actively involved in the search for John Smith in 2020. His name was Mark Peterson. He was one of the most active members of the search teams, knew the area well, and showed himself to be a responsive person who sincerely wanted to help the missing man's family. However, when Mark Peterson's background was checked, some disturbing facts came to light. It was discovered that several years ago he had been convicted of kidnapping, but was later released on parole. This fact aroused grave suspicion among investigators. An active search for Mark Peterson began. Imagine the investigators' surprise when they discovered that Mark Peterson had disappeared shortly before John Smith's remains were found. He had vanished without a trace. His house was empty. His personal belongings were still there, but he was gone. This coincidence seemed too suspicious to investigators. Mark Peterson became the prime suspect in John Smith's murder. A nationwide search was launched. Mark Peterson's photo appeared in all local media and police stations. With Mark Peterson's disappearance, the investigation took on a new feverish pace. Now investigators had not just a ghost from the past, but a specific person with a name and face. A man who not only had a criminal background for kidnapping, but most disturbingly, had personally participated in the search for his victim. This took the case to a completely new level of cruelty and cynicism. The first step was to obtain a search warrant for Peterson's house, located on the outskirts of a small town a few dozen miles from where John's body had been found. The house was a perfect match for its owner, discreet, isolated, surrounded by a high fence. Inside, there was an almost sterile order. No personal photographs, no decorative objects, nothing that spoke of a life, hobbies, or connections. Everything was functional, austere, and aesthetic. Investigators methodically searched every room, every drawer, every shelf. In the office, topographical maps of the Arizona desert were spread across the table. The maps were covered with pencil markings. Several areas were circled in red. One of these areas corresponded exactly to the location where biologists had found John Smith's skeleton. It was the first direct evidence linking Peterson to the crime scene. Next to the maps were several books. Their contents sent chills down the investigators' spines. They were survival guides for extreme conditions, detailed reference books about Arizona's flora and fauna, with special focus on saguaro cacti, their structure and growth characteristics. There was also an old, worn book about knots and bindings. On one of the pages describing how to secure loads with wire, a corner had been folded. Peterson's computer was on, but the hard drive had been professionally formatted. Cybersecurity specialists had a haunting task ahead, trying to recover any data. Still, it was clear at first glance that Peterson had taken care to cover his digital tracks. The most important discoveries awaited investigators in the garage. It was a real workshop. Tools were arranged in perfect order on the workbench. Among them were powerful wire-cutting pliers. Experts immediately took them for comparative analysis with the cuts in the wire with which John had been tied. In the corner of the garage was an empty cylinder from a portable gas burner, identical to the one whose charred handle had been found at the crime scene. But that wasn't all. Hanging on a nail was an old military belt, precisely like the pieces found beside the skeleton. The buckle was missing. Each new discovery added another heavy brick to the wall of evidence against Mark Peterson. It was becoming clear that this was no accident. The man who lived in this house had methodically and coldly prepared for the crime. He had studied the area, gathered equipment, and rehearsed his methods. In parallel with the search, police began questioning everyone who had any contact with Peterson. Neighbors described him as a withdrawn and antisocial person. "Quiet, always alone," said one. "Never greeted, just nodded. Often drove somewhere in his old pickup truck for several days. Always alone," added another. No one could say anything definitive about him, except that he seemed like a strange and antisocial recluse. Much more valuable testimonies were provided by other volunteers who participated in the search for John Smith in 2020. Many remembered Mark Peterson. He was indeed one of the most active volunteers. He knew the area well, gave practical advice, and inspired confidence. However, in light of the new circumstances, some aspects of his behavior now seemed sinister. One of the volunteers remembered how Peterson insisted that everyone should search in the northern sector, assuring them that a lost tourist would instinctively go there, away from the rocky plateaus. It was in the opposite southern sector that John's body was found. It was discovered that Peterson, using his authority as an area expert, deliberately led the search teams in the wrong direction. He played with them, enjoying his power and impunity, knowing that his victim was slowly dying just a few miles away. Investigators dug into the files of Mark Peterson's old case. Several years before, he had been convicted of kidnapping a young woman. The scenario was frighteningly similar. He had taken his victim to a remote area, not a desert, but a forest. He kept her captive in an abandoned cabin for several days. The woman miraculously managed to escape and call for help. At trial, Peterson behaved calmly and detachedly, showing no remorse or emotion. His motives remained obscure. He demanded no ransom nor used sexual violence. Psychiatrists who examined him concluded that his main goal was to establish complete control over another person, to derive pleasure from their fear and helplessness. That case didn't end in death. But now it was clear that in the years since his release, his violent fantasies had evolved. He had become more cunning, more sophisticated, and much more dangerous. He no longer wanted simply to hold his victim captive. He wanted to cause their death, prolonging their agony for as long as possible. The desert, with its scorching sun and predators, became his new instrument of torture. The picture of the crime was becoming clearer, but the main question remained unanswered. Why John Smith? Investigators found no evidence that Peterson and Smith knew each other before the events of March 2020. Their paths had never crossed. Most likely the choice of victim was random. Peterson may have simply been stalking solitary tourists, and John, with his desire for solitude in the wilderness, was the perfect target. He was a predator, and the desert was his hunting ground. A nationwide search was launched for Mark Peterson. His photo was distributed to all states. Border patrols were alerted, but Peterson seemed to have vanished into thin air. His old pickup truck was never found. He could be hiding anywhere, in another state, under a different name, or even lurking somewhere in the endless expanse of desert that he knew like the back of his hand. The case was becoming increasingly macabre, but the main culprit remained at large, and no one knew where or when he might strike again. The feeling of incompleteness and imminent danger weighed not only on investigators, but on all residents of Arizona. The story of the skeleton tied to the cactus became a modern legend, both terrifying and absolute. Months turned into years, and Mark Peterson still hadn't been found. The active phase of the search gave way to routine work. His name and photo were in wanted criminal databases, but no new leads emerged. Peterson's truck seemed to have disappeared, leaving no traces on surveillance cameras or license plate recognition systems. It seemed he had an almost supernatural ability to vanish. For investigators and Silver's family, it was a time of oppressive and challenging waiting. They had the culprit. They had built an almost flawless chain of evidence, but justice couldn't be served while the main suspect remained at large. John Smith's case was in danger of becoming another archived case, a case with an identified but never captured killer. Hope faded with each passing day. The breakthrough came from where it was least expected. A team of cybercrime specialists who had been working for months on Peterson's formatted hard drive managed to partially recover some data fragments. It was a titanic task, like assembling a mosaic from thousands of microscopic fragments. Most of the recovered files turned out to be system junk of no interest. However, among them was a browser cache containing several search queries made a few weeks before Peterson's disappearance. He was looking for information about abandoned mining towns and isolated hunting lodges in neighboring states. with particular focus on sparsely populated mountainous areas on the border with New Mexico. There were also queries about how long a person could survive with minimal provisions and how to avoid detection by thermal imaging cameras. It was a clue, weak but real. Peterson wasn't just fleeing. He was preparing for a long life of self-sufficiency far from civilization. The information was immediately forwarded to federal marshals and sheriff's departments in neighboring states. A new, more focused phase of the search began. Instead of scouring vast areas, teams concentrated on checking hundreds of abandoned properties scattered throughout the mountains and deserts. The work was slow and dangerous. Many of these places were difficult to access and in a state of deterioration. Several more months passed without results, but then one day, a sheriff's office in a small county in New Mexico received a call from a local forest ranger. He was making his regular rounds of a remote section of the national park when he noticed something strange. An old miner's cabin, long abandoned, which had remained for decades with its windows boarded up, now looked different. The windows had been carefully sealed from the inside, and a thin thread of smoke rose from a rusty pipe on the roof. The forest ranger didn't approach and immediately reported his suspicions. A capture team was sent to the specified location. The operation was carefully planned, taking into account that they were dealing with a cunning and dangerous man. The cabin was surrounded. The area was ideal for an ambush: dense forest, rocky terrain, and ample cover. Deputies repeatedly addressed the man inside through loudspeaker, shouting Mark Peterson's name and demanding he surrender. There was only silence in response. No movement, no sound. After several hours of waiting, the decision was made to storm the cabin. Special Forces soldiers broke down the door and rushed inside, but there was no fight. Inside, in the single room of the log cabin, Mark Peterson was sitting on a crude bed. He was dead. A pistol was on the floor beside him. Apparently, he had committed suicide a few hours before the team's arrival, possibly hearing the noise of the helicopter or noticing people approaching. The interior of the cabin was as Spartan as his house. There were some canned food, a water supply, maps of the area, and tools. He left no suicide note or explanation for his actions. He had decided to take his motives with him to the grave. However, investigators searching the cabin found one thing that became the final silent and haunting chord in this case. On a small table beside the bed was a Polaroid photo. The photo showed a giant saguaro cactus against a dark, stormy sky. It was an almost exact replica of the last photo that John Smith sent to his friend before disappearing. Peterson had obviously taken the photo himself, standing in the same spot, perhaps moments before committing his crime. This photo was his trophy, his only and final confession. Forensic examination confirmed Mark Peterson's identity. Ballistic analysis confirmed that he had shot himself with a weapon he had legally purchased many years earlier. The case of John Smith's murder was officially closed due to the death of the main and only suspect. Justice in the form that was expected was never served. There was no trial, no sentence, no public condemnation. The man who committed one of the most brutal and inexplicable murders in the state's history took his own life in a lonely cabin in the middle of the wilderness. All that remained were the facts. A young tourist who died a painful death in the desert, and his killer who took the secret of his madness with him. The infinite Sonoran Desert of Arizona, which became the scene of this tragedy, remains silent as it has been for hundreds of years, leaving the central question unanswered. Why?